Luke Carver tightened his grip on the platform rail, the wood cold enough to bite through his gloves. The stagecoach rumbled in from the Bitterroot Pass, its wheels cutting a mean track through frost and gravel. He'd spent a year writing letters to a woman named Clara Bennett, promising himself, promising his boy, a new start, a home with warmth in it again. But when that coach door finally groaned open, his breath caught in his throat. Two women stepped down. Not one, two. And they were identical. Same face, same dark hair, same way their coats whipped in the raw Montana wind. Only the set of a chin told them apart. He thought he was meeting his bride. What he got instead was a choice that would tear his world apart. The iron rims of the wheels struck sparks against stone hidden by the frost. That bitter mountain air stung his lungs, thick with the smell of wood smoke from the depot stove. Every letter he'd sent, every word he'd read from her, had felt like a plank in a bridge he hoped would carry him and his 10-year-old son Ethan out of the lonely quiet that had settled over their ranch since his wife passed. The coach jolted to a stop. The door swung wide, and his chest just hollowed out. Two women, dark traveling coats snapping in the wind, the same face, twice, twin sisters. He'd expected a wife, not a riddle dropped at his feet. The first woman stepped forward, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Carver?" Her voice was the one he knew from the letters, steady, careful. This had to be Clara. The second woman just stood there, her chin lifted a little higher, her eyes bright and measuring him up. He learned her name was Maggie in a breathless, tangled introduction from Clara. Clara's gloved hands twisted together, a nervous flutter. "There's been a change in circumstances, Mr. Carver. I could not come west as I had intended." She glanced at her sister, a flicker of something he couldn't read in her eyes. "Maggie insisted I not leave you and your boy without help." Luke's gut clenched hard. Beside him, Ethan was tugging on his sleeve, his eyes wide with the pure miracle of two faces so exactly alike. The boy whispered, his voice a ghost in the wind, "Pa, which one's ours?" Luke didn't have an answer. He didn't have a single word. The depot agent just carried on, slinging mail sacks onto a cart, completely indifferent to the storm that had just broken over Luke Carver's life. He'd thought he was getting a wife, someone to steady the ranch, to soften the sharp edges of his grief, to fill the empty house with a woman's touch. Instead, fate had sent him two sisters. One bound to another man, the other daring him to make a choice he never asked for. And in that frozen, silent moment on a Montana platform, Luke knew the hardest winter of his life was just beginning. He felt like the stagecoach wheels had rolled right over his chest and kept on going. He'd read Clara's words for months, thought he knew the sound of her voice, the shape of her hopes, the feel of her steady hand in ink. Now she stood right in front of him, and she had the same soft smile he'd pictured 1,000 times. But beside her was a copy of that smile, only bolder, as if it was daring him to blink first. Clara cleared her throat, her hands still fussing with her gloves. "Mr. Carver, I owe you the truth. Our father, he pressed me into a marriage I could not refuse. It was sudden. I had no choice." Luke's jaw hardened into a line of granite. "You had a choice to write me all those letters. A man makes plans when promises are made, Miss Bennett." He could feel the anger, cold and sharp, rising in his chest. He'd sold 2 good horses to pay for her passage. He'd built a room onto the house with his own 2 hands. "I know." Clara's gaze fell to the frosted planks of the platform, shame flickering across her face. "That's why Maggie came. She insisted." The second sister, Maggie, took a step forward. Her boots crunched on the gravel with a sound that was definite, final. She pulled off her traveling gloves with brisk, no-nonsense movements and met his eyes without a hint of apology. "I know I'm not the one you wrote to," she said, her voice lower than her sister's, steadier. "But I can do the work. I know how to keep accounts. I can cook, I can ride, and I can mend fences if I have to. You need a partner. I'm here." Luke just blinked at her nerve. He was looking at Clara's face, but he was hearing a different kind of fire in her words. "This ain't a game of substitution, miss." He felt the need to draw a line, to take back control of a situation that was spinning away from him. "No," Maggie said, and she crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture of pure defiance. "It's a chance. For both of us." Just then, Ethan tugged his sleeve again, harder this time. "Pa, she looks just like the other one." Luke glanced down at his boy. Ethan's eyes were shining with a kind of wonder, fixed on Maggie as if she were a magic trick, a sleight of hand performed by the mountains themselves. And then she did something that twisted a knot in Luke's gut. She crouched down to his son's level, her skirts pooling on the cold, hard ground. Her smile softened, losing its sharp edge. "You must be Ethan. Your pa has told me so much about you. How old are you?" 10. The boy puffed out his chest, proud. "Well," Maggie said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, "I've got younger cousins back home, and not a single one of them can throw a rope straight. You think you could show me how sometime?" The boy's face split into a wide grin. He nodded eagerly, all his earlier confusion forgotten, and Luke felt something break inside him. This woman, this stranger, had won over his son in less than a minute. Still, he kept his own voice as cold and even as the winter air. "I didn't send for two women. I didn't ask for a mix-up." Clara stepped back, her hands now folded tightly in front of her, as if holding herself together. "I'm so very sorry, Mr. Carver. I thought I could, but I cannot. Please don't fault Maggie for my weakness." Luke let out a long breath through his nose, a plume of white in the air. Snow was starting to dust the brim of his hat. He couldn't just leave her stranded at the depot. He couldn't leave either of them. The town gossip would skin him raw before sundown. "Fine," he finally muttered, the word torn out of him. "You'll ride to the ranch. We'll see if you last the week." Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just picked up her satchel, gave a firm nod, and followed him to the wagon as if she'd always belonged there. The road out of town wound through frosted pines, the wagon wheels crunching a steady rhythm on the frozen ground. Ethan chattered from the bench beside Maggie, pointing out familiar ridges and hollows, his earlier unease completely gone. Maggie listened, really listened, asking him questions, her laughter soft and low. Luke held the reins tight, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The smell of pine pitch and horse sweat and cold, clean air filled his lungs, but he couldn't shut out the sound of her voice. Every so often, he'd catch her profile out of the corner of his eye. It was Clara's face, her perfect likeness, but it was sharpened somehow, lit from within by something fierce and unyielding. He hated how much it unsettled him. The ranch finally loomed ahead, a column of smoke rising from the stone chimney into the pale sky. He'd asked for a wife. He'd prayed for a partner. What he'd gotten was a stranger who wore his bride's face and dared him not to want her anyway. And as he looked at the quiet, lonely house he called home, he had the sinking feeling that bringing her here was either the best thing he'd ever done or a mistake that would burn it all to the ground. The wagon wheels ground to a stop in front of the Carver ranch house. It was a broad, sturdy log structure, with smoke curling from the chimney and a filigree of frost clinging to the porch rails. It was his home, built with his own sweat, but right now it looked stark and unwelcoming. Luke swung down from the wagon, his boots crunching hard on the frozen earth. He half expected Maggie to hesitate, to balk at the roughness of it all, the isolation. He was braced for tears, for regret. Instead, she climbed down herself, her skirts brushing against the dusty wheel, then hoisted her own satchel as though she'd been hauling her own weight her entire life. "Where should I put my things?" she asked, her voice as calm as a summer morning. Luke was so taken aback, He could only jerk his chin toward the porch. Inside. Second room on the right. She walked up the steps without a backward glance, not waiting for him to help her. Ethan trailed right behind her, his boots thumping on the wood, already firing off 100 questions. Did she know how to ride? Could she cook flapjacks? Did she like dogs? Luke muttered something under his breath, a low growl of frustration. This wasn't what he'd sent for. Not at all. But when he finally stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots, a wave of warmth hit him that was different from usual. The fire in the great stone hearth was already stoked higher, blazing cheerfully. And Maggie had already found the kettle and the water pump. She was pouring water into the pot with a brisk, sure efficiency, as if she knew exactly where everything was, as if she'd lived there all her life. The house felt different, less empty. By sundown, she had a stew simmering on the stove, and it smelled richer and more savory than anything Luke had eaten since his wife Martha had passed on. He sat at the big wooden table, silent and watchful, as Ethan devoured a bowlful, chattering on between bites about his day. Maggie ladled out a second helping for the boy with a small, knowing smile. When she finally met Luke's gaze across the flickering lamplight, her eyes held a challenge. It was a look that said, clear as day, "See? I belong here." The next morning dawned sharp and cold, with a layer of ice riming the water troughs. Luke was up before the sun, saddling his horse in the quiet of the barn, expecting Maggie to stay inside where it was warm, tucked away with Ethan. Instead, as he led his horse out into the pale light, the cabin door opened and she appeared, bundled in a thick wool coat, her boots laced up tight. Her hair was pinned back, but stray wisps were already escaping, dancing in the wind. "I can drive the wagon into town with you," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Luke frowned, pulling his hat down lower. "It's a rough ride. Icy." "I've driven worse," she replied, and she proved it. Her hands were firm and steady on the reins, guiding the team over treacherous, icy ruts with a concentration that surprised him. The wagon slid once, a sickening lurch, but she corrected it instantly, her jaw tight. Luke found himself watching her hands, her grip on the leather. It was Clara's face, yes, but Clara's letters had spoken of needlepoint and reading by the fire, not wrestling a supply wagon over a frozen Montana trail. In town, however, the gossip came as fast and cold as the wind. At the general store, Mrs. Talcott, the town's foremost busybody, saw Maggie step in beside Luke, and her eyebrows nearly flew off her forehead. "Why, Mr. Carver?" she clucked, her voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "You certainly do waste no time." Luke stiffened, his hand clenching on a sack of flour. He glanced at Maggie. Her cheeks flamed a bright red, but she just smiled politely, a mask of calm. By the time they'd collected flour, sugar, lamp oil, and nails, the story had already spread like a brush fire. Luke heard the whispers as they walked down the street. Wrong bride. 2 of them, they say. Poor Carver don't know which is which. He ground his teeth, his jaw so tight it ached all the way home. The silence in the wagon was heavier than the supplies in the back. That evening, as snow flurries began to whisper against the window panes, Luke went out to the barn to split kindling, needing the hard, mindless work to quiet the noise in his head. A moment later, the barn door creaked open, and Maggie was there, a cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. "You shouldn't be out here in the cold," he said, his voice gruff, not looking at her. "And leave you to do all the work alone?" She didn't wait for an answer. She just stooped, gathering the smaller pieces of split wood, stacking them in a neat pile. "You don't have to like me, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but I will prove my worth." The lantern light flickered across her face, catching the stubborn set of her jaw. For a single, startling heartbeat, Luke forgot to swing the axe. She looked so much like Clara, the woman he'd imagined sharing his life with. And yet, She looked so much like no one else he had ever met. He forced his gaze back down to the chopping block. "It ain't about liking," he grunted, needing to push her away. "It's about trust." "Then let me earn it," she said softly. The axe bit deep into the block with a sharp crack that echoed in the cold, silent rafters. Days bled into weeks, and Maggie kept her word. She was the first one up in the morning and the last one to rest at night. She helped him tally the ranch accounts by lamplight, her quick mind catching small but costly errors he'd been making for years. She mended Ethan's torn shirts, teaching him old Missouri folk songs while she worked, her needle flying. Once she even helped him haul a newborn calf out of a frozen ditch, her skirts hiked up, her boots caked in mud, never once complaining. Luke tried to keep his distance, to maintain the wall he'd built around his heart, but it was getting harder. Sometimes, at supper, a lock of her dark hair would slip loose from its pins, and she'd brush it back with flour-dusted fingers, and he'd catch himself staring, his fork halfway to his mouth. Other times, he'd hand her a hammer while they were fixing a loose board on the porch, and his fingers would brush against hers, and a jolt of heat would shoot up his arm like lightning. He told himself it was just loneliness. He told himself she was Clara's sister, a temporary arrangement, nothing more. But one night, he woke in the dark to the sound of Ethan crying out from a bad dream. Before Luke could even swing his legs out of his cot, he heard Maggie's soft footsteps, then her low, calming voice. He listened as she sang softly to his son, a gentle lullaby, until the boy's breathing evened out and the house went still again. Luke lay awake long after, staring into the darkness. Because Maggie Bennett wasn't the bride he had asked for. She was the one fate had sent anyway. And it was getting harder and harder day by day not to want her. The storm rolled in without warning, a true Montana blizzard. One moment, the peaks of the Bitterroots were sharp and clear against a pale winter sky. The next, they vanished completely behind a solid wall of white. The wind began to keen, a high, mournful sound that slid down the valley, rattling the shutters and driving the snow so thick and fast that the barn, only 50 yards away, disappeared from view. Luke shoved the cabin door shut against the gale, the latch groaning in protest. "We won't be going anywhere till this breaks," he said, his voice grim. Ethan cheered, thrilled at the prospect of an unexpected holiday from his chores. Maggie, however, only set her jaw with that familiar determination. She pulled another thick quilt from the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. "Then we'll keep the fire fed and the boy warm." For the next day and a half, the three of them were huddled inside, a small island of warmth in a raging sea of white. The old house groaned around them, the timbers shivering as if the building itself were alive and afraid. Maggie kept herself busy, refusing to be idle. She baked biscuits, the warm smell filling the small cabin, showing Ethan how to cut the dough with the rim of a tin cup. Luke sat at the table, repairing a piece of tack, the familiar work of his hands usually a comfort. But today, his eyes strayed to her more often than to the leather straps he was mending. He watched the way the firelight played in her hair, the efficient way she moved around the kitchen, the easy smile she gave his son. It was a scene of domestic peace, the very thing he'd longed for, but it felt fragile, like a dream he might wake from at any moment. By nightfall, the wind had risen to a howl, like a pack of starving wolves circling the cabin. Ethan, exhausted from the day's excitement, curled up beneath a quilt on the rug before the fire, his cheeks rosy from the heat, and drifted to sleep as Maggie hummed an old, quiet hymn. Luke stood at the hearth, staring into the dancing flames, the silence between them growing deeper. "He sleeps easier with you here," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. Maggie glanced up, her fingers stilling on the boy's hair. Children know when a house is too quiet. Silence makes them uneasy. Luke swallowed hard against a sudden lump in his throat. His ma, she died bringing him into the world. The house has been quiet ever since." The words hung heavy in the warm air. He'd never spoken them aloud to anyone but the preacher and his own reflection in a dark window pane. He watched Maggie's eyes soften with a sorrow that looked genuine. She drew the quilt a little higher over Ethan's shoulders. Then she rose and moved to stand closer to the fire, her hands outstretched to the warmth. "I loved a man once too," she said, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I thought he was steady, but he had a weakness for cards. He gambled away our family farm, piece by piece, and left me and Clara with nothing but his debts and the shame." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she steadied it, her chin lifting. "I swore that day I'd never again trust another man's promises." They stood there in the flickering lamplight, two strangers bound by circumstance, each carrying their own ghosts. Luke flexed his hands, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work. "Seems we're both still paying for someone else's choices." "Maybe." She met his gaze across the flames, and for the first time he saw a profound vulnerability in her eyes. "Or maybe we just get to choose again." The fire popped, showering a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Luke's chest tightened. He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to step closer, to cup her face in his hands, to erase the hurt that was etched so clearly there. But then the image of Clara rose in his mind. Her identical face, her twin, her mirror, and it held him frozen to the spot. Maggie was the first to look away, smoothing down her simple dress. "Best get some rest. A storm like this will mean twice the chores come morning." That night, the storm inside the cabin felt almost as powerful as the one outside. Ethan woke up crying out from a nightmare, his small voice sharp with fear. Luke stirred on his cot, ready to go to him, but Maggie was already there. He watched from the shadows as she lifted the boy into her arms, rocking him gently, her body a shield against the terrors of the night. She whispered a Missouri lullaby, her voice low and steady, until his panicked breathing eased and he slept again, his head nestled against her shoulder. Luke lingered in the doorway, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs at the sight. Maggie in the rocker, Ethan cradled against her, the lamplight painting her profile in soft gold. For a fleeting, painful moment, it looked exactly like the family he had once had, and the one he never, ever thought he could have again. When Ethan was settled back on his pallet, Maggie herself drifted to sleep in the chair, too tired to move, the quilt still draped over her shoulders. Luke crossed the room as quietly as he could, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He took another blanket from the chest and gently pulled it over her, tucking it in around her. He hesitated for a long moment, his hand hovering near her cheek, inches from her warmth. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. He wanted so badly to touch her, to smooth the worried line from her brow. Instead, he clenched his fist, letting the moment pass, and turned back to his own cold cot. But he lay awake for hours, listening to the storm rage outside, his heart aching with a truth he didn't dare speak aloud. Clara had never come, but Maggie was here, and she was slowly, surely, becoming the anchor his broken home had been missing for so long. By late January, the great storm had passed, but it left behind a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of white. Drifts piled high as a man's head lay against the fence lines, and the world was silent, muffled by the snow. Luke and his two ranch hands, a grizzled old-timer named Jeb and a young kid barely out of his teens, rode out every day to check the herd, their saddle scabbards holding axes to break the thick ice on the water holes. Maggie stayed behind with Ethan, her days filled with mending harness, baking bread, and keeping the fires stoked against the lingering, bone-deep cold. A week later, on a trip into town for supplies, word reached Luke that sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Cattle rustlers were working the valley again. A lean winter always made desperate men bolder, and this winter was the leanest in memory. He bought extra cartridges for his rifle, loaded the wagon with more than he needed so he wouldn't have to come back soon, and from that day on, he kept the rifle leaning by the cabin door. It was on that same trip that fate, with its cruel sense of irony, tossed Clara Bennett back into his path. He saw her standing outside the mercantile, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a local woman he recognized as the banker's wife standing at her side. When Clara turned and saw him, Luke's heart gave a hard, painful jolt, the same shock he'd felt that first day at the depot. Two faces, one body, duplicated by God himself. "Mr. Carver," Clara said softly, her voice still holding that careful, polite tone. She drew her fine wool cloak tighter around herself. "I hope Maggie is well." "She is," Luke said, his voice curt. He was in no mood for pleasantries. "She's working hard." Clara's gaze searched his, a troubled look in her eyes. "And you, Mr. Carver? Do you regret that she came instead of me?" The question cut deeper than he expected, and it caught him off guard. He thought of Maggie's easy laughter with Ethan, her quiet strength during the blizzard, the way she had started to fill the crushing silence of his house. None of it matched the timid, hesitant woman standing before him now. "No regrets," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse, not wanting to continue the conversation. But as he rode away, he could feel Clara's eyes on his back, troubled and searching. The encounter stirred up the town gossip all over again, the whispers running like wildfire that Carver's bride had doubled, and he was caught between two identical sisters. 2 nights later, the rustlers struck. Luke and his men had spent the day driving the main herd toward the sheltered southern meadow, miles from the ranch house. The outlaws were clever, and they'd been watching. While the ranch hands settled in for the night with the herd, 3 riders circled back under the cover of darkness, dismounting in the deep shadows of the pines that ringed the cabin. Inside, Maggie was darning one of Ethan's socks by the firelight. She heard it first, the crunch of a boot on snow, too heavy and deliberate for a branch settling. Her head snapped up, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled Ethan, who was dozing on the rug, close to her side. Then she reached for the rifle Luke had left by the door. She set her jaw, her knuckles white on the cold steel. "Get under the table, Ethan," she whispered, her voice tight but steady. "And don't you move or make a sound until I say so." The door handle rattled. A man's voice, slurred with whiskey, drifted through the thick wood. "Easy pickings. Rancher's gone for the night." Maggie didn't hesitate. She chambered around, the metallic schlick-schlack sounding deafeningly loud in the quiet room. When the latch finally lifted and the door began to swing inward, she fired a warning shot into the door frame. Wood splintered, the blast echoing like a thunderclap through the house. "You won't take one step farther," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. Outside, the men cursed, scrambling back from the doorway. One of them returned fire blindly. Glass shattered as a bullet punched through the window, whining past Maggie's head. She didn't scream. She dragged Ethan behind the heavy cast-iron stove, shielding him with her own body as another shot cracked, this one from outside, from a different direction. It was followed by Luke's shout, a roar as fierce and unforgiving as a mountain lion's. "Get away from my house!" He and the hands had seen the riders' tracks circling back. They'd ridden hard, cutting the rustlers off. Hooves pounded the frozen earth. More gunfire roared, a chaotic symphony of violence, until at last a heavy silence fell, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. When Luke burst through the splintered cabin door, his face a mask of fury and fear, he found Maggie crouched over Ethan, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her eyes blazing in the lamplight. "I kept him safe," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Luke's throat tightened, a knot of emotion so fierce it almost choked him. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled them both into his arms, crushing her and the boy against his chest. "You did more than that," he whispered into her hair, his own voice shaking. "You saved him." Later that night, after Jeb had dragged the two captured rustlers into town to face the sheriff, Luke returned to the firelit house. The broken window was boarded up, the shattered glass swept away. Maggie sat at the table, the rifle laying across her lap, her hands resting on the stock. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but resolute. It was Clara's face, but fiercer, more alive than he had ever seen her sister's. "Clara wouldn't have lasted a day out here," Luke said quietly, the truth of it hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "But you—" His voice broke, and he couldn't finish. Maggie swallowed hard, her own composure finally starting to crumble. "I never wanted to be her shadow." "You're not." Luke stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. "You're the woman who fought for my boy. You fought for this ranch. You fought for me." For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Maggie let herself tremble, a deep shudder running through her body. Luke gently took the rifle from her hands, set it carefully aside, and then folded her into his arms, holding her tight as the last of her strength gave way to tears. The house was finally still, the world outside snowbound and dangerous. But for the first time since Martha's death, Luke Carver felt the crushing weight of his loneliness lift. Not because Clara, the woman he thought he wanted, had failed him, but because Maggie, the woman he never knew he needed, had been sent in her place. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows along the rough-hewn log walls. Ethan, exhausted by the fear and the eventual relief, finally slept soundly, curled on his pallet near the hearth, his breathing deep and even. Outside, the world lay hushed and still beneath the heavy blanket of snow, as if the violence of the storm and the gunfire had never happened. Luke sat across from Maggie at the table. The lamplight caught the angry purple bruise on her cheek, where a shard of flying glass had grazed her. A part of him wanted to rage, to hunt down the third rustler who had escaped and make him pay for daring to bring fear into his home, for marking her. But the image of Maggie, steady and fierce, with that rifle in her hands, refusing to yield a single inch of ground, that image silenced every other thought in his head. "You saved him," Luke said again, his voice rough with emotion. Her fingers, which had been twisting in her lap, went still. Any woman would have tried. "No," he said firmly, leaning forward. "Not every woman. Not the one I wrote all those letters to." He stopped himself, his jaw tightening as he thought of Clara's delicate hands and her fearful eyes. Maggie's gaze lifted to his, her eyes fierce and yet deeply uncertain. "You mean Clara?" Luke gave a single sharp nod. "I thought I wanted her. I thought I needed a gentle hand, a quiet partner to share the load. But she couldn't have stood here tonight. She would have shattered." He paused, his own voice thick with a dawning realization. "You didn't." Maggie's throat worked, but no sound came out. She looked down at her hands. "And yet," she whispered, "every time you look at me, you see her face." "Not tonight," he said, his voice dropping lower. He leaned farther across the table, his elbows resting on the worn wood. "Tonight I saw you. Not Clara's shadow, not a replacement. I saw Maggie Bennett, the woman who stood her ground and kept my son alive." She blinked fast, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've always been afraid," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "Afraid that I'd never be more than her mirror image, that no matter what I did, I'd always be the second choice." Without thinking, Luke reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with his own. His calloused palm was warm and steady against her skin. "You are not second to anyone, Maggie. You're the one I want at my side. You're the woman I've been praying for all this time, and I was just too blind to know it." The silence between them throbbed with the steady crackle of the fire and the beating of his own heart. Maggie's lips parted, her breath shallow and quick. "Luke," she whispered, and his name on her lips was a question and a plea all at once. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He came around the table and dropped to one knee beside her, never taking his eyes from hers. He cupped her hands in his, the rough texture of his skin a stark contrast to her own. "I don't have fancy words, Maggie. I'm a plain man. All I've got is the truth. And the truth is, I'm falling in love with you." He saw the shock, the hope, the fear all warring in her eyes. "Marry me, Maggie. Not because this was a deal meant for Clara. Not because the ranch needs a woman's hand, but because I need you. Ethan and I, we need you." For a long moment, she simply stared, the tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over, tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Then she bent forward, pressing her forehead to his. "Yes," she breathed, the word a sigh of relief. "Yes, I'll marry you, Luke Carver. Not as anyone's substitute. As myself." His lips found hers, tentative at first, then with a deep, reverent certainty. It was a promise sealed not with a blaze of passion, but with a quiet, profound recognition. Here, by the fire, with his son sleeping safely nearby and this strong, brave woman in his arms, Luke Carver finally let go of the grief he had carried like a brand for so long. And in its place, something new, something fierce, and something incredibly tender began to take root. Snow still blanketed the valley when the Carver wedding day came, but the sun shone bright in a crisp blue sky. Christmas lanterns, saved for a special occasion, swung from the rafters of the big barn, their warm glow casting a golden light across the rough timber beams and the hay-strewn floor. Neighbors from all over the valley packed the space shoulder to shoulder, their heavy coats steaming in the cold air, their voices hushed with the kind of holy quiet that comes with witnessing something that felt bigger than just a wedding. It felt like the mending of a community, the forging of a new beginning. Luke stood tall at the front, his son Ethan standing beside him in a jacket that was 2 sizes too big, but made the boy beam with a pride so fierce it almost hurt to look at. Every few moments Ethan would tug at his sleeve, whispering in an awed voice, "She's really going to be my ma, Pa, for true?" And Luke would rest a steadying hand on his son's shoulder and say, "For true, son." Then the big barn doors swung open, and Maggie entered. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, a hand-me-down from Clara, but she had made it her own, mending it with careful stitches and adding a sash of deep red ribbon at the waist. Her dark hair caught the lantern light, shining like a raven's wing. And though every single face in that crowded barn knew she looked exactly like her sister, not a soul mistook her. She walked with Maggie's stride, proud and sure and unafraid, her eyes fixed only on Luke. When she reached him, Ethan broke rank and slipped his small, gloved hand into hers. "Ma," he whispered, testing the word on his tongue like a secret, precious gift. Maggie's knees nearly buckled. She bent down, kissed the top of his hair, and whispered back, "Yes, son." The preacher's words were simple and heartfelt, carried on the frosty air. Promises were made, vows were spoken, and 2 simple gold bands were slid onto fingers. When the preacher asked Luke if he would take this woman, Luke's voice rang out, strong and clear for all to hear. "I already have." A ripple of warm laughter went through the barn, as warm and welcome as spiced cider. And when it was Maggie's turn to answer, her voice trembled just a little, but it held steady and true. "I take you, Luke Carver, not by chance, not by mistake, but because this is where we were always meant to be." Applause thundered through the barn, the sound echoing off the high rafters, mingled with cheers and the enthusiastic stomp of heavy winter boots. Outside, as if on cue, the bells from the little church down the ridge began to ring. their joyous chime carrying clear and bright through the cold valley air. Afterward, folks lingered, sharing fresh-baked bread and hot cider, telling stories and swapping gossip in the warm lantern light. Some still whispered about how it had been Clara he'd sent for in the first place, how the whole strange affair had nearly split apart because of it. But when they saw Luke's arm wrapped protectively around Maggie's waist and saw Ethan tucked safely between them, his face lit with a happiness they hadn't seen in years, no one could deny what was plain as day. This was a family, not one born of convenience or letters sent across the country, but one forged by fire and chosen by love. Later that night, long after the last of the guests had hitched up their wagons and headed for home, and the lanterns in the barn had been dimmed, Luke led Maggie out onto the porch of the cabin. The valley lay before them, silvered and silent under a full moon, the sharp peaks of the mountains gleaming like teeth against a blanket of stars. "Storms will come again," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. "Rustlers, too. Life out here will be hard." Maggie slipped her hand into his, her fingers lacing with his own. "I don't need it to be easy, Luke. I just need it to be true." He turned and kissed her then, a deep, sure kiss that spoke of homecoming and promises kept. And with Ethan sleeping soundly inside, their herd safe in the pastures, and the vast, beautiful, and dangerous Montana sky stretched out above them, Luke Carver finally knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he hadn't lost a bride that day at the depot. He'd found the only one who was ever meant for him all along. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing these tales to life.